Okay, let's continue with welfare analysis, which builds upon demand and supply analysis and introduces the new concept of welfare. And welfare analysis is one of the most important, if not the most important tool to analyze public policy. So let's start with the market equilibrium. So we have demand and supply. And you can see here such a market equilibrium, and we have a demand function, and the demand function has the inverse the inverse demand function is given by demand is P, because that's on the y-axis, equals 10. That's the intercept. The slope is -1 minus 1 times Q. The supply function is given by the function, again, P. The intercept is 2. The slope is 1 plus 1Q. So now we can see that there is a market equilibrium, and the market equilibrium is at an equilibrium price of 6 and an equilibrium quantity of 4. So if we plug in for Q4, then we get 10 minus 1 times 4, that's 6, and 2 plus 1 times 4, that's also 6, so that's an equilibrium. So the question is, what happens if the market is not in equilibrium? So this is our equilibrium. So now let's say the price is 9. Well, at the price of 9, quantity demanded is 1 and quantity supplied is 7. So we have excess supply. So what happens when there is excess supply? So that means that you can think of it that there are lots of items that are in the shelves in the store that nobody buys. So then the store owner probably has the great idea, maybe I should lower the price. And if the price is being lowered, of course, quantity supplied goes down because many producers are no longer anymore able to supply at that price, but the lower price lures in more consumers to buy the good, and it increases quantity demanded. And that adjustment mechanism will take place until we reach the equilibrium price of 6 and the equilibrium quantity of 4. And likewise, if the price were 3, for example, so it would be very, very cheap, then quantity supplied is only 1, because not many producers can supply at this price and still make a profit. But at the price of 3, quantity demanded is enormous, in this case 7. So now you can think of it this way, that lots of people come to your store and ask, oh, where is the good that I can buy for 3? And then you say, I'm sorry, I don't have it. But then you realize maybe I should increase the price. If you increase the price, that induces many more producers to supply, that increases quantity supplied, but at the same time, higher prices reduce quantity demanded until we reach again an equilibrium. So the market equilibrium is a very important concept because, as we mentioned earlier, a market equilibrium is a situation where there are no people or no economic actors left anymore who could engage in mutually beneficial voluntary trade. So in order to illustrate that concept, let's introduce a different perspective. You can think of a market demand function as a lineup of people, consumers, according to their willingness to pay. And every point on the demand function is, think of it as one consumer. And we can also think of the supply function as a lineup of producers from lowest reservation price to the highest reservation price. So now you can see that to the left of the equilibrium quantity of 4, there are only people whose willingness to pay the reservation price is greater than producer's reservation price. So they can engage into mutually beneficial voluntary exchange. So for example, this first green dot is a consumer, this first blue dot is a producer. This consumer's willingness to pay a reservation price is greater than the one of the first producer. So they somehow will negotiate a price, and after a while, that is the invisible hand of the market, there will be, eventually people will figure out that the equilibrium price is 6, and then the price stays 6 in the equilibrium. But now if we go beyond the equilibrium, so here there are only producers whose reservation price is much higher than anybody's willingness to pay. So if there are only producers left who would charge a price of more, who would have to charge a price of more than 6 in order to cover all their costs, but there is no person left anymore to pay 6, of course, those people will not engage in any trade. So that is why the market clears at the quantity of 4 and the equilibrium price is 6. And sometimes I like to use the term that at the price of 6, the quantity turned over in the market is 4. Okay, but it will become more important as we go into some distortions of the market equilibrium, because that is what we do in the next couple of slides. So now we take the market equilibrium and we conduct the welfare analysis with respect to the market equilibrium. Then we distort the market equilibrium through economic policies like a price floor, price ceiling, a tax, a subsidy, and similar distortions. And then we conduct the welfare analysis. So now we need to go into the concept of welfare analysis. And I have here another slide. And you still see I have already prepared some tools that I can copy. And now I just replicate quickly this graph to the left. Okay, so now we said we have demand and supply. And so now we introduce the first part of the welfare analysis, which is consumer surplus. So if the equilibrium price is 6 and the equilibrium quantity is 4. So now this is the equilibrium price and that is the equilibrium quantity. So now we said earlier that the demand function can be thought of as a lineup of people according to their willingness to pay. So that means everyone in that market has to pay a price of 6, but there are some people, they would be willing to pay 10, others would pay 9, 8, 7, 6, and so on. So that means those people, they get more utility than what their willingness to pay us. So there's like somebody, let's say this is a bar and you can get a milkshake for $6. Somebody's craving a milkshake would pay 10, but they have to pay only 6. So in this moment they get consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is, in geometric terms, this triangle. That's supposed to be a triangle. Okay. Or this area here, that's why I prepared it. So this green area is consumer surplus. So now we can also identify this area. So how big is this area of consumer surplus? So in this case, we would say consumer surplus is equal to, it's a triangle, so we do base, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And the height is 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 times 4 over 2, that's 8. So consumer surplus is 8. Okay, so this is consumer surplus. And again, what we did is we said the demand function can be thought of as a lineup of consumers according to their willingness to pay. And because all consumers pay the same price, some consumers whose willingness to pay is greater than the actual price, they receive consumer surplus. And again, the willingness to pay is the maximum price a consumer would pay in order to realize a certain utility. And from a marginal perspective, if the consumer paid as much as a willingness to pay, the cost of consumption would be exactly equal to the utility. So the marginal utility is the reservation price of consumers, meaning that at prices higher than the marginal utility, consumers could not buy. So now this green area, or here on the right side, this area is consumer surplus, and it's part of welfare. Okay, so now let's remove all that ink again. Okay, so if there's consumer surplus, you can probably already guess there's also producer surplus. So here we have producer surplus. And let's do it again here. So if the price is 6, well, I have to do that again. If the price is 6, the equilibrium price is 6, and the equilibrium quantity is 4. So then we said there are some producers, their reservation price is much less than 6. So there are like some producers who would actually sell a small amount of a good for a price of less than 6. And remember, we assume a market that is competitive. So we have a lot of consumers and a lot of producers. That's why we can think of each point on the supply function as one producer. So there are like producers that produce a small amount at a price of 7, but they could get 6. So they get producer surplus. And the producer surplus, of course, decreases the more is being demanded and produced. So the total area of the producer surplus is now this blue area, or this one. Okay, so now we already have 2 areas. We have consumer surplus, and we had consumer surplus. And consumer surplus we made green, so I'll make that again green. Okay, so now both consumer surplus and producer surplus together, this is what we call total surplus or welfare. So total surplus or welfare is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And we said earlier this consumer surplus is 8, and the producer surplus, this area, it's also 8. So 8 plus 8 is 16. Okay, so this is total surplus. So now what you see here on the next slide is a summary table which will serve as a reference for market distortion. So we do a welfare analysis, and that welfare analysis lists all the relevant parameters that we have in a certain situation, like price, equilibrium quantity. The little star stands for equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus. So let's just replicate that here. So we have a table, we have our parameter, and in the market equilibrium, so the equilibrium price we said is 6, P star 6, then the equilibrium quantity is 4, then consumer surplus is 8, producer surplus is that blue triangle, that's 8, so total welfare or total surplus is 16. Okay, so this is what we need to keep in the back of our mind. So this is the market equilibrium. So now in the next slides we start doing economic policy and evaluate economic policy. And the first policy that we introduce is a price ceiling. So let me just remove those areas again. And let's remove the ink. Okay, so now we have a price ceiling. So a price ceiling is a maximum price which is below the market equilibrium price. So let's assume that the government thinks that the market equilibrium price of 6 is too high, and we should limit it to a price of 4. So now the government sets a price of 4. Okay, so now we have the scenario of a price ceiling of 4. So now if the price is 4, so here's the price. Let's make it red. So now we have to do a welfare analysis for the scenario here where the price is 4. So now again here we have our parameters that we need. And here we have now the values for a price ceiling of 4. Okay, so now the price is 4. It's not an equilibrium price. So, but now at the price of 4, how much is quantity demanded? Well, at the price of 4, quantity demanded in this case is 6. But how much is quantity supplied? So quantity supplied, however, it's only 2. So we have excess demand. Okay, so but now if 2 are being demanded but 2 are only being supplied, what is the actual quantity turned over? Quantity, I call it TO, the quantity turned over. How much economic activity is actually being generated? Well, and the answer is only 2. Because if only 2 items are being put into the shelves, well, even if the consumers would like to have 6, not more than 2 can be taken out of the shelves. So the quantity turned over is 2. So now that means that we need to conduct our welfare analysis to a quantity of 2. Okay, so now we have to do our welfare analysis to our quantity of 2. Okay, so now how big is consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus is everything above the price and below the demand function, because the demand function is a lineup of the reservation prices all the way up to the quantity turned over. So this little triangle is part of consumer surplus, but now we need to add also a rectangle. So let's add a rectangle too. So here, okay, so this green area is now total consumer surplus. So how big is this area? Okay, so this area is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then on top we have 9 and 2 halves, so this is 10. If you remember what we had in the market equilibrium, the consumers had only 8. This is what you see here to the left. So now they get actually plus 2. So the consumers are indeed better off. Well, fewer people get something to buy, but those who buy something, they get so much more utility that it ultimately outweighs the loss in utility of those who are now no longer anymore served. Well, but now let's take a look at producer surplus. How big is producer surplus? So producer surplus is this triangle here. So how big is this triangle? So this is obviously only 2. But if you compare it to the market equilibrium, the producers, in the market equilibrium, they got 8. So now they lose 6. Okay, so how big is now total surplus or welfare? So total welfare is now 12, which is a loss of 4 because we used to have 16. So that's a loss of 4. Well, that makes perfect sense, because if the consumers gain 2 and the producers lose 6, there must be a net loss of 4. And that net loss of 4 is what we call a deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is 4. DWL, that's the deadweight loss. and that is 4. And of course, graphically, this is this triangle here. Let's make that maybe gray. So this dark gray area is the area of 4. You see, it's a triangle. The height is 1, 2, 3, 4. The base is 1, 2. 2 times 4 is 8 over 2, that's 4. Okay, so we can see that a price ceiling makes the consumers better off, but it makes the producers worse off, and in absolute terms more worse off than what the consumers are made better off, so that we have a deadweight loss. Okay, so now let's do another example. Okay, so now we have the first model, which is a price ceiling. And so here again, you can see the same thing on the slides. And okay, the price ceiling here, the deadweight loss is here yellow. But so now let's do a price floor. So now we have a price floor. We can delete all these here. Okay, so now we can do a price floor and a price floor of 8. So now let's do a price floor of 8. Okay, so now the price is 8. So if the price is 8, so then how big is quantity demanded? Well, that's 2. Quantity demanded is 2. Quantity supplied is 6. Okay, so now what we can see here is we have excess supply. Okay, so now 2 are only being demanded, but 6 items can be found in the shelves, but they rotten away there. So that means that the quantity turned over is again only 2. So at this point we can already see whenever the government messes around with the market equilibrium price, we reduce economic activity. So now we have to conduct our welfare analysis to a quantity of 2. So the relevant quantity for which we conduct our welfare analysis is 2. So how big is now consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus is now this triangle, which is only 2. But in the market equilibrium, if you still remember, we had consumer surplus 8. So now the consumers lose 6. How big is producer surplus? So producer surplus is everything above the supply function and below the price that the producers get. So now we have this blue triangle, but now we also have another blue triangle. So I have to make that blue. So now this area, the blue area, is again 1.5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that is a gain of +2. Because the producers in the market equilibrium, they got 8. So now total welfare is again 12, which is a loss again of 4. And again, if one group gains 2 and the other one loses 6, there must be a net loss of 4. So the deadweight loss is 4. And again, we can see that deadweight loss in this gray area. Okay, so now we discussed the impact of a price ceiling and a price floor. So here we had quantity demanded was 2, quantity supplied was 6, quantity turnover 2, consumer surplus 2 was a loss of -6, producer surplus 10, a gain of 2, and welfare 12, deadweight loss 4. Okay, so you see, whenever the government tries to come up with a price which they think is better than the market equilibrium price, that's not going to be in the right direction. Okay, so but now let's take this example here, where we have a price floor of 8. A real-world example would be maybe a minimum wage. That would be a real-world example. Let's say the minimum wage. So the minimum wage would be an example of a price floor. So let's assume we really agree that if the market equilibrium price were, let's say, $6 per hour, that no one could make a decent living of it. And we want to support the workers. So in this case, the supply is basically the labor, the workers, and the demand for the workers are the companies that hire the workers. So the supply would be the workers. So let's say we really want to help the workers, and yeah, I think that is a reasonable thing to do and a good investment in a society to prevent too much poverty and hardship. But then, is the minimum wage really a good policy? Well, let's say the unions, the labor, well, the unions, they have now more resources available. Their total surplus is 10. And it was an increase of 2. But it comes at a very high price, which is that the consumers actually lose 6. So I would have a much better solution how we could help the workers. And that one has to think a little bit outside the box. If you want to help the workers, take a look again at the market equilibrium. Let's say the consumers are the taxpayers and the citizens. The total consumer surplus is 8. What would happen if we just tax them 4? Well, if let's say we tax the consumers 4, at the end of the year we gave them 4, and we just give it to the producers of labor, the workers. So we just redistribute. Well, then total welfare is still 16, but consumer surplus would be now 4, 8 minus 4, after they are being basically taxed. Well, then the consumer surplus of 4, 8 minus 4, is still better than the 2 after the minimum wage or the price floor. And the producers, if they get 4, the workers, we just give them 4 as like a cash transfer, for example. Then their total surplus is 12, which is still better than the 10 that they get with the minimum wage. So I still remember when I was a student, I had a professor, and he always said, and that's really important, he always said, in economics, allocation efficiency in economics, allocation efficiency always comes before redistribution. So what that means is, if we really want to help, let's say, the workers, because we feel that the wage that somebody gets when working in a low-wage job is not enough to support a decent living, we still have to let the market clear. So in other words, what that means is we have to let people work at $6. So now we have maximum welfare, and then we redistribute, maybe by making money available in the form of a cash transfer to those most vulnerable people in society. But trying to accomplish redistributive objectives with market manipulations, that never really works out. At least not in this case. So, okay, so I hope that is clear how we conduct welfare analysis. So, okay, so now let's see. So we did the price ceiling, price floor. The next one is the implication of a tax. So let me just take those areas again. Maybe we need them later. And let's okay, so now we start again with our demand and supply. So again, the inverse demand is 10 minus Q, and the other one is 2 plus Q. But now we introduce a tax. So now we do a welfare analysis of a tax of 2. So welfare analysis of a tax of T equals 2. So now the market equilibrium price normally would be 6 and equilibrium quantity would be 4, but now we introduce a tax. And what the tax does is it shifts the supply up by 2. So now this here is our supply plus the tax. Okay, so now we do our welfare analysis. So here we have again our parameter. and here we have tax of t equals 2. Okay, so now after the tax, what is the price? So the price is now obviously 7. So the price is 7. And what's the equilibrium quantity? The equilibrium quantity is now 3. And that is quantity demanded, but also quantity supplied. So we can say quantity demanded is 3, quantity supplied is 3, and the quantity turned over is 3. Okay, and I'll just gray out that other so that we can see that the relevant supply is the black one. Okay, so the consumers, they pay 7, and again, consumer surplus is everything below the demand function and above the equilibrium price all the way to the quantity turned over. So this area is consumer surplus. So how big is this green area? Well, height 3, 1, 2, 3, base 1, 2, 3, 3 times 3 is 9, 9 over 2 is 4.5. So consumer surplus is 4.5. So how much do the producers get? Well, the producers, they get, well, at the cashier you pay 7, but then the cashier has to give 2 to the government. That means the net price that the producers get is only 5. So this 5 is the net price that the producers get. So that means the producer surplus is everything above the true supply function, and of course the true supply function is still this one. That is their real cost of production, their real reservation price is here, but they get only this price, they only get 5. So that means producer surplus is this area here. So producer surplus is also a triangle, base times height, 3 times 3 over 2, 4.5. Okay, but now we have this gap in between here. Well, this is what the government receives in tax, because we turn over 3 units in the market, but each unit generates a tax of 2 to the government, so we get tax revenues of 3 times 2, which is this area here. So this red area is the tax revenue, and that is 6. So now when it comes to consumer total surplus or welfare, we say welfare is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus, but also plus tax revenues. So that is also part, because it used to be consumer surplus, but now it's being turned over basically to the government. If the government wants to, it can give it back, but it's not being lost. So now, how big is welfare? So welfare is now 15. And that's a loss of -1. And here we can say, okay, consumer surplus, each one lost 3.5 relative to the market equilibrium. You still remember in the market equilibrium, it was always 8 and 8. so they lose 3.5. So consumers and producers lose together 7, but the government gains 6, so there's still a net loss of 1, so the deadweight loss is 1. And of course, as you can already guess, this area here is the gray area, is again the deadweight loss. Okay, so that's the tax. So now we can ask another question, which is about the tax incidence. So in this case, tax incidence is related to the question who pays the tax. Tax incidence, who pays the tax? Well, we can see in this case that part of the tax is basically a replacement of what used to be consumer surplus. So we had once this area here used to be also consumer surplus in the market equilibrium. But that's now being handed over essentially to the government. And likewise, this lower area here used to be producer surplus, and that's also now going to the government. So in this case, we can say that the tax is paid equally by producers and consumers. And yeah, but that doesn't have to be the case. If the supply, for example, were horizontal, so if you had a scenario like this, yeah, let's just do that. So in this case, the tax was paid equally. But let's take another example. Let's assume we had a supply function like this. So it's basically horizontal, and now we put a tax of this one. Also of 2. Well, if the supply initially is 2 and now it is 4 with the tax, well, in this case the entire tax would be paid by the consumers, because before the tax there is no producer surplus, everything is just consumer surplus. But now, if there is a tax, the first thing that will happen is that quantity demanded will fall from 8 to 6, and then we have 6 times 6 units turned over, each one carries a tax of 2, so that means the entire tax would be this presumably red area, and you see it is all being fed by former consumer surplus. So okay, and likewise, so in other words, whenever the supply curve is horizontal, the entire tax incidence falls on the consumers. But if we had a perfectly vertical supply function, so let's say we had a supply function which is vertical. So a vertical supply function is something that you often can observe, let's say, in agriculture. If you have a vineyard, you know, it's not easy to change the growing of grapes and switch to something else like apples. So very often the supply in agriculture is what we actually call highly inelastic. So if the prices change, the demand, the supply doesn't change. But we'll talk about elasticity later. But just to get an idea, so now let's say if the supply is this, and so the price is 6, and the quantity is 4. So now if we say there's a tax of 2, well, if the farmer tries to pass on the tax and charge a price of 8, well, what will happen is that, you know, quantity demanded would only be 2, and the farmer would lose a lot of revenues. So at the price of 6, let's say, so think about it this way. If at the price of 6, quantity demanded is 4, so the total revenue is price times quantity, 6 times 4, which is 24. Okay. So if now the farmer is being taxed and the farmer tried to pass on the tax to the consumers, the new price would be 8 and the total quantity demanded would be 2. So now I call the total revenue star for the scenario when the farmer would pass on the tax. So then we would have 8 times 2. So the total revenue would be only 16. But now the farmer still has to pay the tax that he or she collected. So minus 2 times 2, which is 4, so the farmer would be only left with 12. If the farmer tried to pass on the tax. So therefore the farmer is better off if the farmer just pays the tax. So the farmer still charges a price of 6, and then we have 6 times 4, total revenue is 6 times 4, which is 24. And now the farmer has to pay the tax of 4 times 2 out of his or her own pocket, so minus 4 times 2. So now we have 24 minus 8, 16, which is still better than trying to pass on the tax. So that's why farmers and agriculture, they are often exempted from being taxed because they cannot pass on the tax to the consumers. And the idea of a tax is that the final consumer is supposed to pay the tax. Okay, so this is about the tax incidence, and that's a very important question in policy analysis. You typically want to make sure that it is the consumer who pays the tax. Okay, so now let's move on. And okay, so the next one is a subsidy, But I'll just pause the video quickly here to avoid that the videos get too long, and that is already pretty long, and I'll just stop here, and then I'll start with the subsidy in the next video.